Scotland in space, excuse me, I'll just get back in that, of Scotland in space. And then I'll delve specifically into what we're up to at Prestwick and Prestwick Spaceport. So without any further ado, so in terms of what I'll talk you through, I'll introduce me and who I am. I'll talk about Scotland's space ambition, which is quite expansive. We are and we do punch well above our weight. And you may already be aware of that, or not as the case may be, but hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll certainly have a better understanding, and hopefully it'll encourage you or inspire you or whatever, but certainly we're doing some really good stuff within space within Scotland. We'll talk about a satellite launch. We'll also talk about what are called daring to dream. So what else could we do beyond just the launch of satellites? And again, there's some exciting things that we are looking at Prestwick, and around Scotland there's other people doing similar things, but we'll talk specifically about what we are doing and what we are up to. Scotland's already been in space, which you may or may not already know. And what I'll do is I'll outline what we did and when we did it. And one small step is how my involvement in space has inspired me. And I think particularly being a Hammerman, I think I've got to that funny stage in life where, giving back and doing good is really important to me. So I thought about space and the space industry and what I can do to help people from my hometown be engaged in space in some shape or form. So I'll take you through that towards the end. So who am I? So I'm Mick O'Connor. I'm a chartered engineer, a chartered director. I'm a member of the Master Court. I'm a previous Prince Philip Prize winner almost 40 years ago. And I'm currently the programme director at Presswork Spaceport. As you can see, I've been associated with a range of different organisations, and I've worked in sectors including oil and petrochemical, shipbuilding, missile test and evaluation, more recently involved in the space industry. I became a software developer by accident in 2017, but that's a story for a different day. And I started life as a welder in the Clyde shipyards, and that second orange leg is my orange leg. So yes, that was me back in the day when I was in an honest living. In terms of Scotland's space ambition, it is quite expansive. It is something that I am really proud to be a part of. I think that the industry is young enough and small enough that it genuinely does feel like a family, which sounds probably a bit cliched, but it does. We know each other, we're connected, and we collaborate, which is unlike perhaps some of the industries I've worked in the past. But certainly the positives of the Scottish space industry is very connected and very collaborative. So the ambition, just move this down. So the ambition of the Scottish government is to create 20,000 space jobs and secure a £4 billion share of the global space market by 2030. So the Space in Scotland strategy was launched by Ivan McKee, which was the Minister of Business, Trade, Tourism and Enterprise at the Dubai World Expo. And I was privileged to have been there and been part of that, presented at it, and been part of that launch. And I think it was, what was nice was that the whole world was at Dubai Expo that week. It was the Dubai Expo's Space Week. So it wasn't just Scotland that were there, but we had, representatives of Scotland in space. And I think what was surprising people was not just Scotland's space ambition, but what we're already doing in Scotland and what's already established and what is in train. So it's not just a flight of fancy. There's some, really clever people doing some really, clever things already in Scotland, and I'll touch on that a bit later on as well. So the strategy identified four key aims, excuse me. So the first one was to position Scotland as a global leader for commercial space development. Secondly was to establish a range of managed launch and orbital services, including supporting the largest launch capability in Europe. And I will talk about that quite extensively a bit later on, not just about what we're doing at Prestwick, but what we're doing across all the spaceports across Scotland. And we do work together very closely. Point three was then develop a world-leading environmental strategy for Scotland's space industry. And again, there's a view about, if we're launching, how carbon, neutral would that be? And I think it's recognised that, I think all the spaceports are looking at, seriously at net zero and saying, okay, we're going to create a fat carbon footprint, but how do we offset that? But it's recognising the good, particularly around Earth observation. So there's a lot of environmental benefits by having satellites looking at deforestation and various other things. So there is a benefit by getting the satellite into orbit. Excuse me. And finally, is to then build Scotland's international economic opportunities through increased exports and targeted inward investment. And I know through my own personal involvement, there's some really exciting opportunities for foreign direct investment. Not least at Prestwick, but I would say across Scotland. We're looking at the potential of attracting a company or potentially companies to Prestwick to design and manufacture satellites. And again, fingers crossed, if we can pull that off, that will result in the creation of hundreds of new jobs, which is welcome to Ayrshire, but also to Scotland more generally. So as I mentioned earlier, we truly punch well above our weight. So back in 2015 and 2016, I had the privilege of being appointed by the Scottish Government to lead the Aerospace, Defence, Marine and Security Industry Leadership Group. And what we were charged with at that point in time was to do a refresh of the industrial strategy for the sector. And at that point in time, where Scotland is now in space compared to what it was back then, it's almost incomparable where we are now compared to where we were. But we recognised that there was a burgeoning space industry emerging within Scotland. So, I think technically classifying space as a subset of aerospace is technically correct. However, we felt that it was growing in prominence and it deserved recognition within the strategy. So as part of that, we did dedicate part of the strategy to talk about Scotland's burgeoning space industry at that point in time. And again, there was very few players involved. And we created a subgroup that looks specifically at the space sector. And that then emerged to what is now known as Space Scotland a wee bit further down the line. So from where we were back in 2015 to 2016, compared to where we are now, it's evolved quite significantly. And there are bodies such as the Scottish Government Space Group, Space Scotland, that was previously the Scottish Space Leadership Council, but didn't necessarily trip off the tongue. So Space Scotland probably fits a bit better. And Space Scotland is an inclusive organisation, as I'm proud to be part of it. And that represents not just industry, but it represents the trade unions, it represents trade bodies, it represents academia as well. But it is inclusive, which means that any organisation that's in space that wants to play a part in that can, which is good. And we've also got the Scottish Space Academic Forum. And these three bodies and others are leading the way and helping to guide the Scottish Government. As I said earlier, it is a privilege, it's a great industry to be part of, but it's small, it's beautiful, we're well connected, and long may that continue. Back in 2020, There was 133 registered space companies operating in Scotland, employing a total of 8,000 people and generating a GVA of 880 million. Our space ecosystem includes upstream, downstream, and in orbit. So the difference is upstream is anything that happens before the spacecraft or the object gets into space. So that can be satellite design, it can be satellite manufacture, it can be launch activity. Downstream activity is once the satellite is in space and doing its thing, it's how we then stream that data back to ground stations and then make good use of that data for, let's say, for Earth orbit observation, for deforestation, whatever it happens to be, even monitoring wildlife, particularly species that are endangered, and just monitoring those and potentially monitoring the depletion or whatever it happens to be. And now we've also got in-orbit services, and again, that is an area that we in Scotland are active in. It is probably the least developed sector, I would say, within space generally in terms of doing stuff in space. I think we tended to focus on getting into space and then doing something with the data that we'd retrieve from satellites. But I think there's now a recognition that we're looking to have lunar bases, we're looking at interplanetary travel, which means that we need to be doing stuff, not just sending stuff into space, but also doing stuff in space. And again, I'll talk about that a wee bit more in detail later on. So some companies, I think, just to be aware of and keep an eye on. So firstly, we've got R3 IoT, based in Glasgow, led by Alan and Kevin. Two great guys, a really good company doing some really special things, but they're providing effectively coverage in dark places. So their beachhead market is an aquaculture. So they're working with salmon industry in particular, but they've got these fish farms or salmon farms in very remote places. And they sometimes have problems with blight, and it's all about the temperature and composition of the water. So they can detect that in real time, whereas before it was literally somebody rowing out a rowing boat and taking some data and going back, put it in an Excel spreadsheet. So they can now provide that on an app in real time. We've then got ASC Clyde Space, but that really were pioneers for the Scottish space industry, led originally and founded by Craig Clark, who's now moved on from the organisation. We've then got Spire Global, a big presence in Glasgow, and they've recently floated on the New York Stock Exchange. We've then got Sky Aurora, so they are a launch vehicle or a rocket manufacturer based in Edinburgh. We've got Inmarsat, Trade in Space, another really great organisation led by Robin Sampson. And what they do is they work with distributed ledger technology. They're focused on coffee as their beachhead market. So they're working with growers in South America, looking at the yield of crops, and then connecting the growers with potentially the end users and buyers. So they've done a transaction to test the technology with a grower, I think it was in Colombia, and a barista in Glasgow. There's Encraft Prospect, who do quantum computing, again, based in Glasgow at the old Fairfield shipyard. They do some really, really clever stuff. And in Glasgow is now becoming regarded as one of the global quantum hubs. So again, certainly a company to watch. We've then got Earthblocks based in Edinburgh, Astro Agency that we think is unique to the world. So it's led by Daniel Smith. And that's a dedicated space marketing agency. So they do all the classic marketing stuff, but they've got some real deep space experts within their employment as well, within Astro Agency. And we at Prestwick work very closely with Daniel and his team, and they're doing an outstanding job for us. And then finally, we've got GSI, which is chaired by Peter Young. And again, they work with data on such stuff such as deforestation. Satellite launch from Scotland. So you may or may not be aware that there are 5 spaceports in development in Scotland. There are 3 vertical and 2 horizontal, and I'll explain the difference in a second. So the first spaceport is the one I'm involved in, which is Prestwick Spaceport, which is a horizontal launch spaceport. We've then got Machrihanish, which is also horizontal. We've then got Spaceport 1 in North Uist. We've got Space Hub Sutherland, which is in the Moyne Peninsula in Sutherland. And then we've got Saxe-Aboard Spaceport, which is on Unst, which is the most northerly island on Shetland. So vertical and horizontal. So what is the difference? So firstly, vertical launch is probably what you're familiar with. So Saturn V. So we've got a long, slim cylinder. We've got a rocket motor that's fueled either by liquid or solid fuel propellant, and that makes its way vertically towards space and exits Earth's atmosphere. So that's vertical launch. Horizontal launch is what we are doing at Prestwick. So we use a carrier aircraft. In our case, we use a C-17 Globemaster. Virgin will use a modified Boeing 747, but effectively what we've got is a horizontal platform that then deploys the launch vehicle. In the case of Virgin, their launch vehicle is strapped to the underside of the wing. In our case, ours deploys from a ramp at the back. And the reason why we particularly like that, in terms of the aerodynamics, there's less of an impact on the trim of the aircraft as the launch vehicle exit the back of the aircraft, as opposed to leaving one side when it drops off a wing. So spaceflight consists of 4 component parts. So the first is what we call an LSO, which is the launch site operator. So that's the people who look after the ground activities and the ground component. So that can be aircraft movement, it can be fueling, it can be refueling. It's looking after the infrastructure and the building husbandry, and also taking care of the license arrangements as well. So that's the LSO. For Prestwick, Prestwick Airport will fulfill that function on behalf of the spaceport. The second is the launch service provider. So the launch service provider, in our case, is a company called Astraeus. They were founded as a US-based organisation. They are now a UK headquartered organisation, and their global headquarters will be Prestwick. And what they look after is the conduct of the mission. Now they procure the launch vehicle, but they are responsible for the conduct of a safe mission. And again, I'll talk about that a wee bit later on. We've then got range control services, or an RCSP. They work as part of the launch service provider, and what they're about is providing effectively a safe space to do hazardous things. And again, I'm going to talk about that a wee bit more detail a bit later on in the talk. And then we've got the launch vehicle provider. So effectively, this is what we commonly known as a rocket. We refer to it as a launch vehicle, but it's more commonly known as a rocket. So there are a few organisations designing and building those rockets and launch vehicles that are Scottish based. So firstly, we've got Orbex, and Orbex are based in Forres, in Moray, and they will support Space Hub Sutherland. Similarly, we've got Skyrona, I mentioned earlier, that will also be doing some launches from Saxe-Aboard in the Shetland. And again, they are an Edinburgh-based launch vehicle provider. So again, what we've got is companies, Scottish-based companies, designing and developing rockets. The Space Industry Act was enacted in 2018, and the Space Industry Regulation came into law in July of this year. The challenge that we've had in the industry to some degree is we've been flying to some degree blind, for want of a better expression, where we didn't have the regulation and we couldn't afford to sit back and wait on it, because we believe that the competition for spaceflight isn't necessarily between each of the spaceports in the UK, but it's other foreign nations such as Norway, Sweden, and Portugal that are potentially looking at launching from the Azores. And we felt that being first to market was really important. So all of the spaceports, to some degree, commenced at risk in the absence of a regulatory framework. So we employed lots of subject matter experts to give us a sense of what that regulatory framework could look like. We did contribute towards it. We did have an influence in it to some degree. But for that period between 2018 and July of this year, effectively with no regulatory environment. So the regulator is the CAA, and they've been fantastic. Again, they are a new regulator working with a new set of regulations. So we're all on a learning curve and we're all on it together. And the CAA, and I would say the industry, I think we've all lent in and says, look, we're going to get, we're going to get a better result. We're going to get a better set of regulation if we are collegiate in our approach. And that's worked, I would say, extremely well so far. And the CAA are also supported by the UK Space Agency, Department for Transport, and the Health and Safety Executive. So horizontal air launch, so that's what I'm involved in the thick of. So on the left-hand side, what you can see here is an artist's impression of Prestwick Spaceport, and I'm going to show you that in a bit more detail in a second. So the Prestwick Ayrshire growth deal was awarded in 2020, and that will create 4,000 new space jobs by 2035. The deal provides for £80 million of a budget to not just build a spaceport, but to build a spaceport in what is known as an aerospace and space technology application centre, commercial buildings and road infrastructure. So the commercial buildings is to attract inward investors, whether that's domiciled UK inward investors or foreign direct investment, but is creating the buildings for those organisations to then occupy, to then employ people and then add to Scotland's GVA. The spaceport itself consists of a payload processing facility, which is this part of the building back here. The launch vehicle integration facility, which is this larger building, and a solid fuel storage building. So in terms of this building here, so the payload processing facility is our customers will arrive with the satellites, which are quite delicate instruments. So they'll be in a ruggedized flight case. They will debox it within that facility. They may do some final assembly, do final functional checks before they then integrate it with the payload dispenser. So the launch vehicle integration facility, we've got a number of stages. So we stack the stages in that building, and then we integrate the satellites within the payload dispenser stage of the vehicle, and then we install fairings, and then we're largely good to launch at that point in time. Our first operational launch is scheduled for Q3 2023. There are a lot of challenges between now and that date. We are working as hard as we can to pull that date to the left so we can launch before then. But in terms of where we are now, I think taking a prudent, risk-based, realistic view of where the programme is and some of the challenges and where the tall poles in the tent are, we think that the final quarter of 2023 is a realistic first operational flight from Prestwick Spaceport. Some of the other spaceports are looking at launching earlier, potentially by the mid part of next year into the autumn next year. I genuinely wish them all the best and I hope they do it. I think it could be slightly ambitious, because I think that the regulation and the new regulator are saying potentially it could take between 9 and 18 months between the submission of an application to hold a license, either to be an LSO or an LSP or an RCSP. So potentially that will push that first launch date they're listed into the early part of 2023. But as I said, I genuinely hope they're successful, because I think we can take a lot of the learning from them and incorporate that into our solution. But as I said, I think there's some risk attached to a launch in 2022. We're looking at launching a payload capacity up to 800 kilograms, which can be one large satellite or a cluster of smaller satellites or CubeSats. And we're looking at access neither polar or some synchronous orbits. So what I'll do is I'll quickly, hopefully this works, I'll show you a short video. There's no sound, but hopefully it gives you a bit of a sense. So hopefully you can now see that. So I'll just narrate this to some degree. So as I mentioned earlier, we're working with a Strauss. So as you can see here, this is a C-17 Globemaster aircraft. So it's a large military transport aircraft. This is our launch vehicle that then would be embodied within the belly, within the fuselage of that aircraft. It takes off as a conventional aircraft, which gives us some advantage because we can get above the weather. Vertical launch can be susceptible to weather conditions, and launches can be scrubbed. So we can get above the clouds and get above the weather. The launch vehicle is then pulled out via a drogue and then a main chute. It then drops vertically. We've then got stabilization and retardation chutes that then deploy. And once the vehicle's vertical, it then drops off. It then ignites and stabilizes, and then autonomously makes its way to orbit. Once it's in orbit, we've got main engine cut off, and then we've got the second engine kicks in, and then the fairings deploy. And as you can see here, there's a larger satellite deploys, and then smaller. And you can see smaller CubeSats starting to dispense here. So again, we've got different configurations. Again, it can be multiple small sats or one large satellite. The time it takes a satellite to actually be operational from the point where it's inserted into orbit, can be many weeks or months, depending on the satellite and the orbit it's looking to get into. And the ideal part of this solution is that we can then return, we can reload, refuel, and redeploy. So hopefully that gives you a sense. Excuse me, just to get at this. Bear with me. Well, let's go back into this. Okay, so we're back on. Okay, so one of the things that I mentioned earlier in the talk was the range control service provider and what they do. So effectively, they create bubbles of safe airspace or sea space that enables the conduct of a mission. So the range control and mission control effectively work in concert. And within the launch service provider's safety case, they've got to make provision for range control, because from a system integration perspective, they've got to be cheek to jowl. So effectively, what the range control service provider is, creates safe spaces for us to do hazardous things. So we've got large swathes of airspace and sea space that we want to then segregate and sterilize so that no air traffic or sea traffic can make an incursion into that space, for the protection of our activity and also for the protection of them as well. So we will lodge things like a NOTAM, which is a notice to airmen, or a NOTMAR, which is a notice to mariners, that basically says keep clear. So when they're creating their flight plans or their navigation orders, whatever it happens to be, then they will keep clear of that space. Now, what we will be using is sensors and radars and satellites that will keep a real-time view on that space to ensure that there is nothing in that space before we deploy. And equally, there's nothing that's got a bearing that's heading towards that space. Okay, so beyond launch. So what we're doing at Prestwick is not just about the spaceport and our launch activity. We're also building a space cluster. And when I was in Dubai a few weeks ago, we talked about not just what we're doing at Prestwick as a space cluster, but Scotland, and particularly central Scotland, as a space cluster, and the uniqueness of it, which I'll talk you through shortly. So in terms of Presswick Spaceport, as I've just taken you through, we are building a global multi-mission horizontal launch spaceport and space cluster. And currently 50% of all the aerospace jobs in Scotland are already based at Prestwick. So we're not just building a space cluster, we're building a space cluster on top of an already established aerospace cluster that's been there for in the region of 80 years. Glasgow, you may or may not know, is Europe's small satellite capital. So 40% of all the satellites manufactured in Europe are manufactured in Glasgow, which is only second to California. So there's a lot of small satellites made in Glasgow. And I would say, in terms of what we're looking at Prestwick, I think it may well be that it extends not just beyond Glasgow, but also to West Central Scotland. I can see that percentage starting to increase. So we're really, as I mentioned earlier, we really punch above our weight. And likewise, from a data perspective, Edinburgh is recognised as Europe's data capital. So we've got the School of Informatics in Edinburgh, we've got the Base Centre in Edinburgh, but again, they're doing some really, really special stuff in Edinburgh. There's over 100 space companies operating currently in central Scotland. And we've got access to some world-renowned universities, not least GCU that I'm involved with, but also Strathclyde, Glasgow, Heriot-Watt, and in Edinburgh. And I think what makes us special in Scotland is that all this expertise is concentrated within a 55-kilometre radius. Now, there are some world-class universities outside Scotland. There are some other organisations that make satellites. There's places that do launches, there's places that do data. But what we don't think there is at the moment is anywhere that's got that real concentration as a cluster. And I think this really provides Scotland, with a real competitive advantage, because we are close to one another. And there's been lots of occasions where I've popped into Prestwick for a meeting, gone to Glasgow, or gone to Edinburgh. It's a hop, skip, and a jump. It's quite easy to do, so we're quite joined up. Whereas if you go to, let's say, for example, the States, again, they do some really special stuff, but there's thousands of miles separating them. So I think that obviously we've got technology such as Zoom and Teams, etc. But I think that human interaction and human contact can be a real differentiator for Scotland. So we're really building that, not just least at Prestwick, but moreover across central Scotland and Scotland as a whole. So we are well connected, and we're well positioned to compete in an industry. And I would say that the industry is estimated to be worth 700 billion by 2030, but I think some people would view that as a fairly conservative estimate. It'll be quite a large industry. It is growing year on year. And what we're looking to do by 2030 is to have a £4 billion share of that market, whatever the market happens to be. So in terms of daring to dream, at Prestwick we've thought about, well, okay, so we're creating a spaceport, we're doing horizontal launch of small satellites, which is great. We're looking to build infrastructure around it. We're looking to attract foreign direct investment. We're looking to create 4,000 jobs. But is that it? What else could we do? So we thought, well, what else is possible? And could we put humans into space from Scottish soil? Is that possible? So we're working with a US-based organisation right now, a very credible US-based organisation. And we're exploring the possibility of crewed space flight from Prestwick. What that would give us the ability to do is a number of things. So we've got about 48 mission configurations that we've thought about, but one would be replenishment of the International Space Station. So, you know, taking astronauts and food and water, etc., to them and taking them back. We've also considered in-space manufacture. So there's certain things that are advantaged by being manufactured within a microgravity environment. So one thing we could do is we could do 3D printing of human organs, where, you know, we potentially could print human organs without fighting against gravity. So we don't necessarily have to put temporary structures within the organ. It'll be self-supporting because it's obviously not fighting against the effects of gravity. We've also got in-space construction. So we're looking at our aspirations to have a lunar colony or interplanetary travel. We'll have the need to perhaps make space stations or large space structures or spacecraft that potentially couldn't be launched from Earth, but components could be, and it could then be assembled and constructed in space. But that then brings its own challenges. Well, what does in-space construction techniques look like? How do you do non-destructive testing in space? And how do you assure effectively the structural integrity of those vehicles to then, you know, support human life and enable them to then go on long journeys? We've also looked at microgravity experimentation. Satellite launch for that vehicle, we could launch up to 2.25 tons. We could bring back a 5-ton satellite because the vehicle returns unfueled. We could also reorbit satellites. So we've got almost a degradation of orbits as satellites tend to fall back to Earth through time, and it could eventually get into the atmosphere and burn up. But potentially you could relife them and reorbit them, or if need be, you could then return satellites back to Earth. The vehicle is a single stage to orbit spacecraft. It is rail mounted. It is rocket propelled. So what we've done in recent times is we've completed a blast analysis, which is favourable, which is good. And what we're currently doing is looking at the noise effects and noise contours and the environmental effects. So what we've done is we've done an analysis as a desktop exercise. What we're now doing is putting microphones around the perimeter of Prestwick to understand potentially how noisy this vehicle could be for particularly the local community of Moncton. There are military jets, there's military fast jets that already go into Prestwick Airport. So would it be discernibly different for this vehicle, or would it literally rattle their windows to destruction? So we will understand more about that. So again, I don't know where that's going to go. I think we'll let the exercise come to its conclusion, and then from there we'll then decide on whether we can fit that vehicle type in Prestwick or not, as the case may be, but fingers crossed. So Scotland's already been to space. So in 2017, an exercise called Formidable Shield was conducted from the kinetic operated MOD Hebrides Test and Evaluation Range. This is a range that I know and love. I managed the range for a year, and then I managed all of the MOD's air test evaluation ranges across the UK. So a really good place, some outstandingly skilled people up there. So they've launched the first, significant object from Scotland and from the UK, for that matter, into space. That exercise brought together 8 NATO nations to test an integrated air and missile defence capability, particularly around ballistic missile defence. So it launched a Terrier aerial target. So as you can see here, so that is not a missile. Effectively, it is an aerial target. It's a large drone, as people would call it, or a unmanned aerial vehicle. And what that was designed to do was to simulate a mid-range ballistic missile attack. So it went into space, didn't go into orbit. It went into space and then returned. And then there was an Aegis destroyer, a US Aegis destroyer, that then took that target out over the Atlantic, and I'll show you that in a second. And it marked the largest and highest object launched into space from UK soil at an altitude of 320 kilometres. So to enable the firing to be conducted, as I mentioned earlier about range control and creating large sterilised areas of airspace and sea space, to enable that exercise to be conducted safely, Kinetic had to create an exclusion zone of 1.1 million kilometres squared, which is approximately twice the size of Spain. So courtesy of my friends at NATS, this is pretty much to scale. So up here you can see this is Iceland. Here we've got where the Terrier vehicle was launched from, or the aerial target was launched from, which was on south-east, and then get into an area over the North Atlantic. So the Aegis destroyer was here. So again, a fairly large undertaking. It took about 18 months to plan that in terms of rerouting airspace. So what you can see here are the tracks where aircraft would tend to make their way to the States, then make their way back in the evening. So we've got a lot of commercial air traffic and a very, very busy piece of airspace. So a lot of probably not too happy operators such as British Airways and Virgin and the like, who had to then dogleg their flights going from the UK to the States and vice versa. So not an insignificant undertaking. I mean, what we will do from a range and control and mission control perspective, it won't be as extensive as that. It doesn't need to be. But again, it gives you an example, or it gives you at least an idea of some of the challenges that we'll have, not just from a horizontal perspective, but from a horizontal and vertical launch perspective. So for me, being a Hammerman and a Greenock boy, similar to my friend James Watt, when I got involved in the spaceport, I thought this is a fantastic thing to be part of. We're looking at creating 4,000 jobs, not just any job, but highly paid technical jobs in the space industry, and bring those jobs to the west of Scotland. I thought, wow, this is fantastic. But I then thought about, well, how many young people like me when I left school are thinking about a career in space? And I thought there's probably some, I think particularly the ones that go to university, we do physics, they do engineering, whatever they choose to do, they may well indeed end up in the space industry. But I didn't think about them. I thought about people like me. When I left school, I mean, I didn't have an academic bone in my body at all. And it's when I started my apprenticeship, I realised that somewhere in that head, there was a bit of a brain that was rattling about. But it took me till I was 16 to recognise that. And I've been really on a journey ever since, aided by the Hammermen. When I won the Prince Philip Prize, it was a real seminal moment in my life. So what I thought about, well, how can I help or enable young people, not just in Greenock, but in Inverclyde, to aspire to a career in space? To see space has been the domain of purely people with PhDs, which is not the case. We do need people with PhDs, absolutely. But there's a room in the space industry for not just people with PhDs, but other people as well. And whether that is, a project manager or a welder or a doctor or a lawyer, there are lots of opportunities within the space industry. So to create new hope for the youth of Inverclyde, I believe that space should represent an opportunity, not just for the west of Scotland and Ayrshire in terms of what we're doing at Prestwick, but should represent an opportunity for all of Scotland. So my hometown of Greenock suffered greatly due to industrial decline, either through the demise of Silicon Glen and semiconductors, or shipbuilding or engineering or sugar, whatever it happened to be. But it's now the poorest place in all of Scotland, very sadly. And that brings with it poverty, disadvantage, criminality, drug use, etc. So really what I want to do in my small way is what can I do what can I do to help, particularly being involved in the space industry and being involved with the Hammermen and being fairly well connected. And I've got a lot of good people around me who will help me, but how can they help me with this particular endeavour? So I've created a charity called Inverclyde Makerspace, and what that is designed to do is create hope, belief, and skills for the youth of Inverclyde. And that's about, give them access to advanced manufacturing, advanced technology, mentoring, entrepreneurship, give them access to employers, give them access to education, higher education. Again, maybe a lot of these young kids don't come from households that's perhaps, been to, higher education, perhaps even further education. They don't necessarily have role models. They perhaps don't come from a nurturing environment. But how do we create that opportunity for them to aspire to something more? And I'm working at the moment with a US-based organisation called Next Fab Foundation. That's a philanthropic organisation, and also supported by Skills Development Scotland and Scottish Enterprise. And we're looking to do a contextual assessment in the early part of next year, and that will then determine what the shape of that thing will be. And this is not exclusive to space, but I thought if I can start in space and give these young folk that hope, belief, and skills to say, do you know what? I can go and work in the space industry. If you can work in the space industry, you can pretty much work in any industry to that degree. So it's just creating that almost aspiration and inspiration in them to then, go and do more with their lives rather than being caught in that spiral of poverty, unemployment, criminality, etc. So final point is Scotland is not just equipped. Scotland is well equipped. We are capable and we're ready. So firstly, thanks for listening. Thanks for your patience. And if you've got any questions, just please feel free.